I join Wes and welcome you to our Bible class tonight. We're glad that you are with us. Even if you're with us tomorrow watching it because you're catching up, we're glad you're here and we're glad we're able to study together. As was mentioned, we are in the book of Judges. We are studying Judges. Chapter 17 is where we'll be tonight. As we talk about the book of Judges, we want to remember we're talking about an era where they are wasting the land God promised. And the book of Joshua, they entered it. The book of Joshua is a book of faithfulness, a book of victory. The book of Judges is a book of futility, a book of loss. And when we come to this latter part of the book of Judges, we're looking at some of the most horrifying scenes to be found in this historical book. We've divided the book into three major sections. The first section being disobedience, Judges chapters 1 and 2. Last week we finished studying the second section of the book, which is the deterioration, which actually contains the events of the lives of those 13 judges whose lives are recorded in this book. When we get to chapter 17, we've labeled this desolation. Now, as noted, we've already talked about all of the judges discussed in this historical book. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and we finally finished with Samson last week. All of the names, some familiar, some maybe not so familiar. Once we get to chapter 17, we're going to be reading about someone named Micah, that I doubt you talk about him every day with your family. We're going to be reading about Micah's mother, a person whom the first words we hear coming out of her mouth are, "Blessed be thou of the Lord, my son." And it's going to sound about like Jezebel saying, "Blessed be thou of the Lord." We're going to be reading about some people who want to talk about God and incorporate God's name in their lives as a readily used noun. But living for God is not a verb that is anywhere near these people's minds. When we get to this part of the book of Judges, the last 5 chapters, 17, 18, then 19, 20, 21, these are not fun chapters to study. Often we open Scripture and we're looking for the positive example. Who did what was right? That's a hard question to answer in these chapters because with very, very few exceptions, more often than not, the answer is nobody. Judges 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. As a student of the Bible, when I come to these passages, I imagine that I look at these much like a forensic expert looks at a crime scene. I've got a responsibility to be here, but this is a mess. And that's exactly what's going to be taking place in front of us. Now we might ask, why do we call this desolation? Particularly chapter 17 and 18, we call it desolation because it's going to begin with theft. A man stealing from his mother, a grown man stealing from his mama. We're not talking about a desperate 10-year-old who doesn't know better and he took $2 out of a purse to go buy a Snickers bar. We're talking about a grown man who stole 1,100 shekels of silver from his mother. Then he tells her what he's done. She's going to say, "Well, blessed be thou of the Lord, my son. You know, I'm going to dedicate it to the Lord and I'm going to make you an idol with it." Well, that's a godly mother, isn't it? Then it moves forward to an abandoned tribe. This man-made religion is going to get connected with the tribe that is abandoning the land that God had given them, and they're looking for something that's easier to take. The Danites wanted the path of least resistance. Actions of ingratitude. These folks from Dan have stayed at the house of Micah, and they realize, hey, this is easy pickings. We'll come back and we'll steal his gods from him, take them with us, and we'll have ourselves our own place of worship up at Dan so that we don't have to travel all the way to Shiloh. Ingratitude and more theft. They steal his gods. A violent threat when Micah tries to chase after them and say, "Why have you taken my stuff?" And then false worship once they get where they're going. Again, who did what was right? We just scratched the surface, but no one. Or then we come to the last 3 chapters. We're going to read about a woman who abandoned her marriage, defiled it by leaving her husband. We're going to read about a Levite who goes, gets his wife, and then on the way home, they stop in a town called Gibeah that is defiled sexually. This town makes Sodom look peaceful. Not only with what their desire is for their visitor, but what they end up doing to his concubine, his wife. And then, in his defilement of marriage, he sends her out to a crowd of men who will abuse her all night. After it's all over, he's going to take what's left of her, divide her into 12 parts because her life has passed, send parts out to the nation and say, see what these people did? And then there's going to be a war that ensues. The tribe of Benjamin is going to try to protect the guilty. No, you can't attack Gibeah. They're our brethren, because blood's thicker than righteousness, apparently. And then the nation will go into a murderous rage, declaring that they're going to destroy all that pertain to Benjamin. By the time it's all said and done, there's a murderous vow taking place. They've killed all of the citizens that they can capture, and now they feel bad about it. Oh no, we've almost wiped out an entire tribe. How are we going to solve this? We know. Let's go kidnap the virgins dancing at Shiloh, and we'll give them to the men that remain of Benjamin. This is some great bedtime stories for the children, isn't it? 17, 18, 19, and 20. Why do we call it desolation? Because it's a moral wasteland. Who did what was right? Few. Very few. Now, why was it desolation? Why are they acting this way? Well, the simple answer is given in Judges 17:6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Incidentally, there was a king. God was their king. Thus, he had declared already back in Deuteronomy, I'm your king. But no. They're saying we don't have a king, so they're doing what is right in their own eyes. And this emphasis of no acknowledging authority comes up again in Judges 18:1. In those days there was no king in Israel. Judges 19:1. And now it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel. And then the entire historical account ends with the statement, now in those days there was no king in Israel. Judges 21, verse 25. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. We'll talk about that statement a bit more as we dig into chapter 17. But suffice it to say for now, they were operating by their own standard of right, which means most of what they were doing was wrong. Why was it a desolation? Because they rejected God's standard. They were just doing what felt right. Now let's ask another question. And this might be one of those answers that we tend to overlook, but when was it a desolation? We just read through the book of Judges, and often we're inclined to take it as a chronological order, but that's not always the case. Especially these last 5 chapters. There's some details contained therein that help us to get a better idea of when these events may have taken place. For instance, Judges 20, verse 28. Second to last chapter, as the people are gathered together and deciding whether to go up and attack Benjamin again or not. It's Phinehas who's the high priest. Phinehas is the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron. Aaron was that first high priest, brother of Moses, 83 years old whenever he was appointed by God to serve as high priest at the beginning of their wilderness wanderings. Died at age 123, Numbers chapter 20. His son Eleazar would serve as high priest after him, and now it's Phinehas that is the high priest. Here's what's significant about that. Joshua 24:33 records the death of Eleazar, the father of Phinehas, who had served as high priest after the death of Aaron. Phinehas would have started serving as high priest upon the death of his father. If we'll take some dates that we can glean from history and then let Scripture do all the rest, we can know as an established date that Solomon started building his temple the year 967 BC. 1 Kings 6 in verse 1 points out that was the 4th year of Solomon's reign. 1 Kings 6:1 points out that the year they started building the temple was 480 years after they left the land of Egypt. Let's do just a little bit of math. 480 years before that, they left the land of Egypt. That would be the year 1447 BC. Now, we know that they were in the wilderness for 40 years. Remember Numbers chapters 13 and 14? For 40 years they will wander. A year for every day the spies went up into the land. Joshua 5 verse 6 records that indeed it was 40 years from the time they left Egypt to the time they entered that promised land. So they left Egypt 1447. They enter the land of Canaan 1407. We're not given enough details about Joshua's age upon entering into the land of Canaan to know exact dates, but we know this much. Joshua was 110 years old when he died, according to Joshua 24. He would have been around 80 to 85 upon entering the land of Canaan, give or take a few years. But if we estimate him being roughly Caleb's age, who was 85 upon entering the land of Canaan, then it would be 25 years from the time they entered the land of Canaan until Joshua died. So that would put that at around 1382 BC. Now let's do some other math. We know that Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign, which means he started reigning 971 BC. 40 years earlier, his father David was crowned. 2 Samuel 5:4 points out that David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. So, from the building of the start of the temple to the beginning of Solomon's reign, 4 years. Then go back another 40 years, that's the beginning of David's reign. Go back another 40 years, and Saul is being crowned king, their first king, according to Acts 13:21. So, the era of the judges ends, absolutely ends at the crowning of that first king, 1051 BC. And that's going to have to include the time of Eli and the time of Samuel. So when we put these dates together, looks like we may have to click through this again. We put these dates together, there's our 1382 date. The events of Judges would have occurred between the year 1382 and 1051 BC. So we have roughly a 330-year span of time for all of these events to take place. Now, where does that come into play? How does that help us figure anything out? We're talking about just over 300 years. Phinehas was a grown man before they ever entered the land of Canaan. You remember, Phinehas was the high priest being described at the end of the book of Judges during the events of Judges chapter 20. Numbers 25:11, it was Phinehas that took a spear and stopped the plague that was spreading through the land by ending a sexually illicit act between an Israelite and his Midianitish accomplice. Phinehas, son of Eleazar, grandson of Aaron, was a grown man before they ever entered the land of Canaan. He was a grown man whenever they arrived in 1407. He most certainly would have been grown, fully mature, perhaps pushing the age of 50, by the time he assumes the high priesthood from his father Eleazar at the end of the book of Joshua. Now, unless Phinehas outlived his great uncle and his grandfather, Moses lived to be 120 years old. Aaron died at 123. Unless Phinehas far surpassed their ages, then the events described in Judges chapter 20 took place somewhere in roughly the first 50, maybe 70 years after entering the land. Put all that together. The moral wasteland that is depicted in Judges particularly 19, 20, and 21, because those are all one section. There's a very strong indication that 17 and 18 occurred very early also. But the horrific events of Judges 19, 20, and 21 took place while Phinehas was still the high priest. We described this as desolation. The desolation didn't arise at the end of the period of the Judges. The desolation arrived shortly after the beginning of the period of the Judges. They served God all the days of Joshua, the days of those elders that outlived Joshua. But then there arose a generation that knew not God. And it didn't take long from there to end up with a generation that thought it was a good idea to impose rape and self-will. A generation that thought it was a great idea to declare we're going to kill out a tribe and then we'll kidnap and have forced marriages to make up for our rash vow. All that we've studied so far, Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jared, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, those judges were judging during a time when the people acted like this. So when we study these last 5 chapters, it's putting the whole book into perspective. Why do we call it desolation? Well, look at the way those people are acting. Why was it a desolation? They did what was right in their own eyes. When? Very soon after they got settled into the land. God says, here's the promised land. And they just start doing what they want to do. Now, let's dig into Judges 17. We're going to call Judges 17 and 18 homemade religion. Tonight we'll just stick with Judges 17. But homemade, maybe even better described as man-made religion. But that's really what it's all about. We start Judges 17, verse 1. There was a man of Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah. Incidentally, Micah's name means who is like God. If his name is followed by a question mark, then the answer has to be not you, buddy boy. He's going to be nothing like God. His name means who is like God. He says to his mother, verse 2, Mom, you know that 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you? You know that money that you were ranting about missing? You were fuming that someone had taken it, about which thou cursest, and spakest of also in mine ears? The silver is with me. I took it. He comes to his mother and says, I stole 1,100 shekels from you. I stole all of that gold. Mama, I did it. Now, as Christians, we're inclined to look at this verse in and of itself before we even finish the verse and say, well, hey, he's acknowledging it. He's repenting. He's making things right. Good on you, Micah. But if we keep moving forward, of course, his mother replies by saying, Blessed art thou of the Lord, my son. Okay. Well, let's see if her sincere utterance is connected to sincere understanding of the God whose name she's just employed. Blessed be thou of the Lord, Jehovah, my son. When he restored the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother, he's given the money back. Listen to her words. She said, I have wholly, the King James says, I had wholly, as though she had previously already made this decision. The better translation is, I do wholly, or I completely dedicate the silver unto the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a graven and a molten image. Now therefore I will restore it unto thee. I dedicate this silver to the Lord. Dedicate, Kadash. I sanctify it. I give it as holy. This is the word used to describe the holy place and the holy things pertaining to the temple. She says, I'm giving this silver as holy. So let's take it and make a graven image and a molten image. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Think about the commandments, the basic command. We're not even talking about the full extent of the statutes and ordinances and commandments. Just the 10 commandments that have been broken here. Honor thy father and thy mother. That means take care of them financially, not rip them off. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. This family is quick to say, blessed be thou of the Lord, and I've dedicated it to God, the God that I've painted on my own wall, the God that I've portrayed in my own head. I've dedicated it. I've made this silver holy unto the Lord for my son. You make a graven image and a molten image. Now there's debate about the meaning of the graven and the molten. But the idea here is simply being this. The graven image is something that's going to be shaped. The molten image is something that's shaped by carving on the graven image, shaped by a pouring on the molten. Looks like the graven image may be a carved piece of wood that's going to be covered. And then the molten image is going to be this silver melted down and put into a mold and made into a specific shape. Based on the weight of 1,100 shekels of silver, we're not talking about talents of silver. We're not talking about 75 pounds worth of silver to accomplish this idol. This is a smaller idol that's being made. Looks like the graven image would have been a pedestal. The molten image would have been the idol put on top of it. What was the shape? We're not told. Can't help but think it might have looked like a calf. Or maybe it looked like some of those Canaanite gods, those fertility images, because the people of Ephraim, according to Judges chapter 1, had failed to drive the Canaanites out of their land, and the Canaanites' attachment to Ashtaroth and to Baal is historical and undeniable. The Ephraimites are right in the middle of all these Canaanites, and here they are talking about God, but Micah and his mama say, hey, we'll make ourselves some images. Even God said, don't do it. Verse 4, at the end of verse 3, she says, now therefore, I'm giving it back to you, baby. You admitted you stole it. Here, you can have it. So, verse 4, he returns the 1,100, and she takes 200 shekels and gave them to the founder, the goldsmith, the metallurgist, who made thereof a graven and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. Blessed be thou the Lord. Here, have some false gods. This wouldn't be the first he had. They've got a man-made standard. Blessed be thou of the Lord. Let's make some idols. I've dedicated this to the Lord. I've made it holy to the Lord. Let's make an image. They don't know what blessedness is. They don't know what holiness is. But they sure know how to sling God's name around and say it with such sincerity and fervor. It's just genuine. Oh, I love Jehovah God. I don't know what he wants out of me, but I love God. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with anything like that today, right? People who have no king in their lives, they do what's right in their own eyes. Listen to the next actions of Micah. The man Micah had a house. He already has this. He has a house of gods, literally a shrine. They've got homemade standards because they're doing what's right in their own eyes. And he has a homemade shrine, his homemade place of worship. Now, God had specifically stated Deuteronomy chapter 12 that this was not to happen. They didn't listen. He has not only a house of gods, he has made an ephod. Now, Gideon made an ephod, but it was a celebratory ephod, not for him to lead in worship. There are two other ephods described in Scripture. David made one for celebration. Gideon's ended up being abused, not necessarily because he set out to do that. David's was an ephod worn in celebration as they brought the ark into Jerusalem. And then there's the ephod that was to be worn by the high priest. Which ephod do we think Micah's trying to imitate? David's nowhere near born yet. Gideon's events may well not have happened yet. Micah has made an ephod because he's going to appoint his own priest. He's got his own man-made shrine where he has his own man-made ephod, homemade ephod, and his homemade teraphim. Teraphim, literally house gods. Idols. Family gods. The idea is of healing. These were a holdover not only from being in Canaan, but some of this mentality could be seen even going all the way back to when Jacob came out of Paddan Aram and Rachel had that god from her father that she had stolen underneath her satchel. Here is something that has been in their history and they've not gotten rid of it yet. Micah has his homemade shrine, his homemade ephod, his homemade teraphim, and he's got a homemade priest. He's consecrated by DeGaulle, set apart, designated one of his sons to become his priest. Son, you be my priest. Homemade standards, because they do what's right in their own eyes. Homemade worship, because they do what's right in their own eyes. Now, before we move forward, let's think about the contrast here. We've already noted that the events of the last 3, perhaps even all of the last 5 chapters of the book of Judges take place early in the history of Judges. Now, if we take that information and we skip back all the way to Judges chapter 3, we're told that they were doing what was right in their own eyes, right? Which means, actually, look at Judges 2 and verse 11. While they're doing what's right in their own eyes, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of God. Lord, I know the way of man is not in him. It's not a man that walks to direct his way, Jeremiah would say, Jeremiah 10:23. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man. The end thereof are the ways of death. When we have our homemade standard of what's good and what's not, when we have our homemade standard of how we should worship, when we have people saying, well, I was born in this denomination, my daddy's in this denomination, I'm going to die in this denomination. Inherited genetic relationship with God as opposed to thus saith the Lord. But then there are those, even among Christians, that will take the environment wherein they were reared and use it as an excuse for the behavior that they refuse to cease. Those that perhaps were brought up in a rough rural environment. Well, everybody drinks there. It's just kind of what we do. So, or those that were brought up in a rough urban environment. Well, listen, you got to stand your ground and can't let anybody mess with you, or else. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. We don't need to act too shocked when we see the same thing happening in the world around us. But we better be very careful. Those of us who are members of the Lord's precious bride, we had better be very careful not to let the mentality that plagued Israel in the time of Judges become a defining characteristic of who we are. I don't have a king, I do what's right. Now, that's not what Micah would have said. That's not what his mother would have said. Not, we have no king, we're just doing what's right in our eyes. They would have said, oh, we're doing what's right to the Lord. We're dedicating it to God. Everything's being blessed to God. Our lives are centered on God. But is it Jehovah God? So, let's move forward. We've got a homemade standard, homemade shrine, and now he's already got a homemade priest, but he's looking to upgrade. Picking up at verse 7. Judges 17 rather, picking up at verse 7, there was a young man out of Bethlehem, Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he sojourned there. Now, let's take a trip back to Joshua for just a moment. You remember the book of Joshua, after they have taken the land, the first dozen chapters, it begins to be distributed among the tribes. And after each tribe has received its allotment, here come the Levites, because they are to receive 48 total cities, 6 cities of refuge and 42 other cities for the family of Levi. The priests, who would have been descended from Aaron, the other sons and descendants of Kohath. Kohath had 3 sons. Levi, had 3 sons: Kohath, Gershon, Merari. Kohath, Gershon, Merari. Their families each had different roles and responsibilities in the wilderness. And then there are the priests: Aaron, Moses, their descendants, particularly the sons of Aaron. When we talk about the Levites, we can get an idea of just whom this may have been when we go back to Joshua 21 and note that this Levite that's described in Judges 17 is coming out of Bethlehem, Judah. A couple of things to note. One, according to Joshua 21, Bethlehem in Judah was not a city given to the Levites. So this Levite dwelling in Judah is not dwelling in a city of the Levites. I wonder why. Some have said, well, perhaps he married a woman that was of the tribe of Judah, and he's living by her family. That's not how that's supposed to work. Well, perhaps he's not able to live in the allotment given to Levi because they're not being supported. Perhaps they're not being supported because this is during a period where they have turned from God, they're chasing after idols, and the tithes that they were then under the Old Testament instructed to give that would go to the support of the priests and Levites was not being distributed. And so here's a Levite that's slap out on his luck, broke and homeless. He's been sojourning, living as a stranger temporarily in Bethlehem, Judah, but his runs run out there, and so now it's time to move. Not just a Levite, though. Joshua 21. Joshua 21, picking up at beginning in verse 9. They gave out of the tribe of the children of Judah and out of the tribe of the children of Simeon these cities that are mentioned here by name. Again, this is going to the Levites. Verse 10, which the children of Aaron, being of the families of Kohathites, who are of the children of Levi, had. Did you catch that? The cities about to be distributed out of Judah are going not just to any Levites. They're not going to Merari or Gershon, or even the non-priestly descendants of Kohath. These Levites dwelling in Judah were to be the priests. Keep that in mind. Because here comes a Levite out of Bethlehem, Judah. In all likelihood, he's a priest. But he's not serving as a priest, and he's not being supported as a priest. He's not able to make a living as a priest. There's a reflection on the nation. Now we pick back up in Judges chapter 17. And we watch this Levite travel northward from Bethlehem, Judah, up into the area of Ephraim. When he comes to Ephraim, he meets a fellow named Micah. Micah Verse 8, the man departed out from the city of Bethlehem, Judah, to sojourn where he could find a place. He's looking for a roof over his head, just looking for a place to stay. He came to Mount Ephraim in the house of Micah as he journeyed. Just happens to come across Micah's place. Verse 10, Micah says to him, verse 9 rather, Micah says to him, whence comest thou? From where are you coming? What was the starting point of your journey? He says, I'm a Levite of Bethlehem, Judah, and I go to sojourn wherever I can find a place. He says, here's where I've been. I don't know where I'm going. Just wherever I can find a place. Micah, he's being nice, right? When he tells this Levite, you dwell with me, and be unto me a father and a priest, and I'll give thee 10 shekels of silver by the year. Mom still has 900 left. I can rob plenty from her each year. I'll give thee 10 shekels of silver by the year, he says. I'll pay you. I'll take care of you. And I'll give you a suit of clothes. I'll give you your food. You will have a per diem. You'll have a salary. I'll even give you a wardrobe allotment. Sounds like a good deal. All the Levite has to do is act like he's serving God apart from the place where God said he's to be served. Now, what do we mean by that, apart from the place where God said he's to be served? Let's leave Judges 17 and go to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy 12, God had told the children of Israel through Moses that when you come into the land, you're not going to act like the people that have been there, and you're not going to act like you've been acting. When you come into the land, you're not going to do, verse 8, ye shall not do after all the things that we do here this day, every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes. That's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that that description is given of how they are not to live, especially in the same context that is about to describe where they are to worship. You're not going to do every man what's right in your own eyes, verse 8. Verse 9, you're not yet come to the inheritance. This is why they're still in the wilderness. This is why Moses is still leading. They've not yet arrived in Canaan. Verse 10, but when you go over Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God giveth you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell safely, then there will be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. Thither shall ye bring all that I command you, your offerings, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your heave offerings, all your choice vows which you vow unto the Lord. All your worship is going to be done at this place that I choose. This place, at this time, is Shiloh. And when we say at this time, we mean at the time of Micah. They should have been going to Shiloh where the tabernacle was. Micah wasn't. God said, you're not going to do what's right in your own eyes. You are going to worship according to my standard. You're going to gather to my place of worship. Not Micah. And not his mama. Micah's made his own house. Now later, this place of worship will be Jerusalem. God will make that abundantly specific when the temple is dedicated. But for now, when we're in the book of Judges, let's go back. But this time, look at Judges chapter 18. The end of the chapter, just to help us make sure we have our bearings. These folks who are going to steal Micah's false gods, they set up Micah's graven image which he made all the time that the house of God, tabernacle, was in Shiloh. So, we come back to Judges chapter 17. We've seen homemade standards. Blessed be thou the Lord. Let's go make us an idol. I've dedicated it to God. homemade shrine, his own place of worship, his own clothing of worship, his own gods of worship, teraphim, idols, family gods, and his own son was a priest. But now he's making a homemade priesthood. He's taking someone that's supposed to be serving as a priest for God, and he's making just a little change, just a little twist. When they're doing what's right in God's eyes, they're going to go to Shiloh to worship. But they're doing what's right in their own eyes. Can we apply this to today? Is there a standard of right in God's eyes when it comes to worship? Does God care how we worship? When? Where? Now, we've not been designated as having to gather at a set building when we're not dealing with the kind of plagues that we're facing now. It is a great convenience and a wonderful blessing when we can indeed gather as the body in one place. But the command for them to go to Shiloh and later Jerusalem was for the Jews. Jesus would tell that one mount, the day cometh when neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem will you worship God. You'll worship in spirit and in truth. The point there being this: when we ask this question, is there a place where we're to worship today? We're not talking about geographic location, but we are talking about a spiritual one. We're talking about a spiritual body. We're talking about the Lord's bride. I couldn't just go to any old tabernacle and worship. I could not just go to any old mountaintop and worship, not under God's law, not in the Old Testament. And today, I can't just gather with any old church and worship. Jesus said, upon this rock I'll build my church. The Apostle Paul said, Ephesians 1, 22 and 23, God's made Jesus to be head over all things to the church, which is his body. The fullness of him that filleth all in all. The church is his body. And in that same epistle, Paul would say, there's one body. One body. He's already said the body is the church. Then he says there's one body, one spirit, even as you're called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. Just as there's one God the Father, one God the Son, one Holy Spirit, one hope of heaven, one faith that saves, one baptism that washes, there is one body into which souls are added when they obey the gospel of Christ. That's his church. The same condemnation that Micah deserved is still applicable today for those that decide that they'll do what's right in their own eyes as it pertains to their worship. So again, we move forward in the chapter. Coming back to Judges 17, we pick up at the end of verse 10, the Levite went in. Now here's someone who's supposed to be a priest. He ought to know better. But he loves silver more than God. And from all indicators, he's living in a difficult time. There's no support for a Levite. The support that was supposed to be there for him to be able to do the work that he was committed to do, it's not there. And so he's bouncing from town to town, place to place. He has become, instead of a priest, a panhandler. Who's doing what's right? Well, it's not the nation. Who's doing what's right? Well, it's not the Levite. Who's doing what's right? Well, it's not Micah. Who's doing what's right? God. And in this case, God only. He's being awfully patient with these folks. Pick up at verse 11. The Levite was content to dwell with the man. Content. He was happy as a lark. Wardrobe allotment, per diem for food, salary, he's got it made. He was content to dwell with the man, and the young man was unto him as one of his sons. Did you catch that? Micah had told this Levite, come, be my priest. You'll be unto me as a father. Now Micah's old enough that he's already got a son that he's appointed to be a priest. As silly as some of his actions are, I suppose it's not completely out of the question to think that he made his 5-year-old son a priest, but it would seem that he already has adult children. Here, the Levite that he says, "You'll be a father to me," is called a young man. Because you're a Levite, you'll be a father to me, a young man. And he wasn't a father to Micah. It ends up being the other way around. The young man was unto him as one of his sons. Who's the authority? The Levite? The one who's supposed to have some semblance of a connection to God's standard of holiness and his sanctified family? The Levite wasn't in a position of authority. He's not in a position of guiding or steering. No, he was unto Micah like one of his sons. Dependent, submissive, right up until we get to chapter 18. But we'll have to cover that next week. Verse 12. Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and was in the house of Micah. And then said Micah, don't miss this part, because God's name gets used repeatedly. These people sure sound religious. They sure sound sincere. They sound like they are lovers of God. Remember Micah's mama? Blessed be thou the Lord, my son. I've dedicated this silver to the Lord. Let's go make us a fake God. Here's Micah with his homemade place of worship, his homemade ephod, his homemade teraphim, family gods, his homemade priest, and now you got a homemade Levite right there. Verse 13, then said Micah, now I know that the Lord will do me good, seeing I have a Levite to my priest. There's so much in this statement. First, he knew better. He knew better than to make one of his sons his priest. Otherwise, he would have told the Levite, hey, why don't you be my priest instead of my son? He knew better than to make anyone besides a Levite a priest, because now once he has a Levite on his payroll, he says, now I know God will do me good because I got me a Levite in my service. He knew better than to develop his own priesthood, but he did it anyway. He knew better. Now I know the Lord will do me good. Not only did he know better, he was nervous. He was anxious. He wasn't certain that the Lord would do him good with his homemade place of worship, his homemade ephod, his homemade religion. But now he's instituted just enough of the God-made religion, because he's got someone labeled as a Levite, serving as a priest. Now I know God will do me good. Now I know I'm a little bit closer to what God had in mind anyway, which means not only did he know better, he knew of God's standards. But he wasn't doing it. No wonder he was nervous. Christians, friends, how many people are living like Micah? Now, this man, when we get to the end of Judges 17, he's not made everything right. He's still on a downward spiral. But he gets to a point where he thinks he's making progress. It was progress that he wasn't going to go out and try to achieve it with his own effort, but once a Levite came his way, he would go ahead and take that opportunity. How many folks are just waiting for an opportunity for God to make life easier so I can be more religious? For God to make life easier so that I can be more righteous? Instead of starting right here where I am, right here where I live, right here in who I am, saying, here's what needs to change. Here's what's not right. It's not right in God's eyes. So it can't be right in mine. Again, these last 5 chapters of the book of Judges are like a crime scene. It's a mess. No one wants to have to walk through this mess. But if we'll pay close attention, we can learn enough from it that hopefully we can move past homemade religion or hand-me-down religion. Hopefully, if we'll pay enough attention, we'll get to the point where we're not using the kind of reasonings Micah used. We're not being the kind of followers of God Micah was. And we're not being the kind of people that use God's name repeatedly, but serve his name nil. The book of Judges, in so many ways, it's oh so pertinent to the world around us today and to the very lives we're leading. Hope you'll be back with us next week when we pick up from here and move forward into Judges chapter 18. Thank you again for being with us this evening.